Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. When I saw the time slot for this session, I was sure we would be the last panel of the day, but we're not. There's more content following. Offshore Wind California does not mess around. So I know you have a very committed group here to keeping it spunky and high energy, especially for the group that follows us. But we are going to talk to you today a little bit about monitoring and mitigation efforts regarding wildlife and fisheries, and we have an excellent panel of experts here with us covering a variety of perspectives on the topic. So I will first we'll go down the row and have everyone introduce themselves and why you are on this panel here today.
Well, thanks so much, Amber, and thanks all for being here. My name is Kris Ohleth. I'm the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. Since 2013, we have been working to advance the responsible development of offshore wind, and really excited to be here on the panel today. My recent project that brings expertise to this panel is regarding compensatory mitigation for the fishing community. So I'll be focusing a lot of my comments on the experience we've had in the fishing community. Getting to the mitigation level, I think we'll be talking a lot about monitoring as well, but really looking forward to talking about that opportunity for mitigation.
Hey everybody, I am Ben Ruttenberg. I'm the director for the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. We're the OG Cal Poly, for what it's worth. And I am on this panel partly representing a large group of folks involved in the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, along with us at Cal Poly, engaged in the monitoring guidance work here to try to understand, what do we know, what do we need to know, how do we try to develop monitoring to minimize and mitigate the impacts of offshore wind in California.
Thank you for having me. I am Grace Chang. I'm the Director of Research and Development at Integral Consulting. I've been working on research and development projects for looking at potential interactions of human infrastructure on marine resources.
And hey everybody, I'm Garry George. I'm a Senior Director of Climate Strategy at National Audubon Society. You know us as the bird people. And so I'm here to talk about birds and offshore wind.
Thank you all. All right, so before we dive into the nitty-gritty of mitigation and monitoring technologies, I want to just take a moment to talk about why you are all speaking at an offshore wind conference. As I've been working with the National Wildlife Federation, advocating for the responsible development of offshore wind energy for a little over 12 years now, and I still very often get asked or met with the assumption as a wildlife advocate at offshore wind conferences and forums that I'm only there to speak about the parameters that we want to put around offshore wind, and not that we also truly want to see it successful, that we advocate for the success of this industry. And given that we are here in a room of people who mostly want to see this industry be successful, I just want to take a moment to really touch on why this matters to you, either personally or with regard to the affiliation that you're here representing. And I'm going to start with you, Garry, because a few months ago, Audubon released a report titled "Developing the Offshore Wind That Birds Need." So can you share with us why Audubon chose to give the report that title? Why and how can offshore wind energy be beneficial to birds?
Absolutely, I'm so happy to do it. And I would just like to advise everybody, if you're on your phone or your computer, just Google Audubon offshore wind and birds. And if the person next to you doesn't have a phone or a computer, you can tell them where it is or send them an email with it. But now you can actually get the report and look at it. So there's a first move right there. And we did this report when we released it in January 8th before the inauguration, and that was on purpose. We wanted to make sure it was out there and we could do congressional briefings and things with the report. But this is in the context of a report that we released. Our scientists worked from 2014 to 2019 on a climate report, and the climate report used just tons and tons of data of where birds are, 100 years of Christmas bird counts, 100 years of breeding bird surveys, precipitation, temperature, and they modeled under 3 scenarios of what would happen to these birds, 600 species of birds in the US, If the warming got to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees or 3 degrees, and we found that at 3 degrees we would probably lose 389 species of those 600 birds. And so that really has framed our climate work. And one of the fastest and quickest ways that we can reduce the emissions and keep that warming down is through clean energy. And when offshore wind came along, and I've been working in it for now, a decade, here in California and also in the Atlantic and Gulf. If those offshore wind projects for us provide the biggest qualitative and quantitative development of energy, it's all during the day, all during the night, and it's also gigawatts of energy, and that'll keep the warming down and that'll help our birds. And that's really why we said this is the offshore wind that birds need.
Thanks, Garry. Zooming out a bit just from birds, I'm going to turn to you, Ben, with a question as on sort of the context of how you think about offshore wind versus the current existing impacts that wildlife are facing in the ocean. So really, how do you compare the development of offshore wind to the absence of developing offshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody to say that we are in a climate emergency right now, and that I do think, as many folks in over the last couple of days and really over the last many years have been saying, we're going to need the all of the above approach to deal with this problem. And so offshore wind alone certainly isn't going to solve the climate crisis, but it's going to be part of that solution. And again, just to kind of put a little context on what happens if we don't think about this, we don't start dealing with offshore wind, we're going to see lots of things dying. As Garry mentioned, almost 400 species of birds are going to be at risk from climate change. In 2014 to 2016, this blob, the marine heat wave, hit the west coast, the eastern Pacific Ocean, right? So this entire coast, and something like 4 million murres disappeared from Alaska, right? And they have not come back, right? So that's half the population vanished as a result of this single marine heat wave. Right, we've heard about the unusual mortality events of whales on both coasts, but especially the gray whales on this coast were dying primarily because they were starving because of cascading ecosystem changes in the Arctic. So climate change is here, and these effects are already happening. And so if we continue to do nothing, it's just going to get worse. And so, I don't know what the impacts, of developing offshore wind are going to be on these animals. Certainly, some of them are going to have some impacts. There's no question about that. But I think it's pretty clear that the impacts from climate change are going to be far more severe, and that doesn't even include all the other things that we're doing to the oceans. Noise and ship strikes and pollution and plastics and everything else that we're doing that is insulting the ocean. So,
Kris, I'm going to come to you next because I think I'd be willing to bet that you may have more years of offshore wind experience than perhaps anyone in this room. Therefore, you've endured more setbacks than most of us have. Why do you stick with it in the face of all of these challenges? Why is it still important to you that we find this path forward for offshore wind energy? And maybe share with the audience what your offshore wind friendship bracelet says, because I think it helps answer this question.
Well, I'll just start by saying it's mostly because I'm a stubborn Jersey girl and I don't give up on things. And I see one of my OG colleagues, Kevin, sitting in the front. So there's a lot of us with a lot of years out there, and thankful that I think we can continue the nucleus that will be the momentum that is 2029. That is so important to our sector. I am a huge Taylor Swift fan, and unfortunately, I did not get a Taylor Swift song to walk out to, but we're going to put that in the comments for Adam. But my friendship bracelet says, I can do it with a broken heart. And for you Taylor Swift fans out there, it's a great song, and you know that it means that we do what we need to do and we continue on regardless of the adversity. We've been focused on responsible development of offshore wind at SIOW, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, for this over a decade now, because I really, kind of hearkening back to what Eddie was saying about the importance of bringing the community with you as you develop these projects. There is not a question that we can't or can build offshore wind. We know how to build them. We know how to finance them. We know how to permit them. We're doing it all over the world. There are 15,000 offshore wind turbines spinning around the world, and about, give or take 100 here in the United States. It's not that we don't know how to do it, but we haven't been able to do it in a way that kind of includes the communities to a point where we have not met so much feedback and objection. So I appreciate that word, saying that we're insulting the oceans. I'm going to use that. But yes, I mean, I think that this idea of responsibility that we all have, and one of my mandates is to tell someone new about offshore wind every day, because even on the East Coast, where we're not even that much further along, frankly, folks still think about offshore wind as a bit of science fiction. They don't know that it's really happening. Even in Virginia Beach, where CVOW is being built, one of the biggest projects in the world, we talked to so many people in Virginia Beach. The project was just 20 miles from there, and they had no idea it was happening. So it's just really interesting about the role each of us play, and I'm just grateful to be able to continue to do that, and hopefully continue that momentum through the next 3 to 4 years where it's so needed.
Thank you. Thank you for helping to lay that backdrop and context. And I think on that note, we will pivot into some of the details of how we hope to see this forward, and really with the focus of our topic being coexistence. We are going to start with monitoring, and I'm going to turn to you, Grace. Let's just start with a bit of a lay of the land for those who aren't following the play-by-play of monitoring technology advancement. Can you just give us a sense of what innovative technologies are being developed to monitor the impact of offshore wind projects on wildlife, and how they're being tested and validated to ensure that they are effective?
Yep, sure. Thank you, Amber. Yeah, it's a really exciting time for sensor development, especially ocean sensor development. In the last couple decades, we have seen momentous leaps in computing technology, right? Computer storage, processing, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And these are not only driving sensor technology development, but also are driven by the technology development. So, for example, Integral is working on a seabird monitoring project. It's funded by the California Energy Commission. We are integrating 3 scales of monitoring technologies that require fast processing and machine learning. So we're integrating biological radar systems. They will get that kind of multi-turbine or multi-kilometer scale assessments of bird and bat density, and as a function of flight height. Then we're looking at turbine scale technologies in thermal imaging cameras. These are really powerful. We can use computer vision. We can start to identify species. We can look at their morphologies, their flight characteristics, and importantly, their behavior around the wind turbines, so whether they're attracted or avoiding these turbine structures. And kind of a unique aspect of our work is that we are looking at that micro scale, so blade-mounted sensors that actually detect an interaction. So we're pulling all these sensors together into one coherent system, which I think is really important for any type of monitoring for wildlife, is not to focus on just one technology or one sensor, but to pull together and get a big picture of the entire system, because ultimately our ocean is one system. So that's the above water. I'm going to go to just some examples of what's happening below water, or for below water species at least. For marine mammals, there's been great advances in infrared camera system to look at whale blows above water. People are even using satellite remote sensing to survey kind of synoptically those surface-dwelling organisms. And then below water, of course, acoustic sensoring. We have the noise spotter, which is an Integral product as well. It is a directional passive acoustic sensor, so we can get not just sound pressure levels, but we can pinpoint from where those directions are coming, which is really important. You can say, okay, we have a threshold exceedance, but you know what? That's because a giant cargo ship went through the area. It wasn't driven by some turbine noise. And then, of course, looking at in interactions with mooring lines and cables, there's been a lot of advancements in uncrewed underwater and surface vehicles that can survey wide areas of the ocean without human intervention, so keeping people safe. And again, this is all facilitated by the ability to collect, process, and serve large quantities of data.
Thank you. Ben, I'm going to turn to you with a question about effectiveness. we just heard about some of the emerging technology. I want to get sort of your candor on how much you trust this technology to work and how we can be working to set up systems that are likely to be conclusive, or that we can trust to be conclusive, and really level set some expectations here.
Yeah, so I do think that the emergence of all of these technologies is going to really provide tremendous improvements in our ability to understand what's happening in these systems. Historically, we've had to send ships out with people on them to go do this stuff, right? That is extremely expensive, it's really time consuming, and we get, not particularly great data in terms of the data density, right? And we know that the west coast of the U.S. is part of the California current large marine ecosystem, right? That runs from Baja from Canada down to Baja. It's a huge system. It is incredibly complicated. It's highly variable, right? And so trying to understand exactly what's happening in one place at one time, and say, this is how the system is operating, is really, really difficult, right? So being able to, collect the data over the frequency and intensity that we need to be able to understand what's happening in these systems is going to be hard. These technologies are definitely going to help us. To level set, I guess I would say that it's going to be really difficult for us to have the sample size that we need to be able to say, we put a turbine here and these things happen, and therefore it's, we can identify that these turbines or that this wind farm is the thing that caused that. That's going to be hard to do. That said, there's still so much that we can learn about these systems, partly by these new technologies and partly by synthesizing the vast quantities of data that we're already sitting on, right? To understand what's happening with our oceans, how are they changing, and and provide some of that guidance. And there's examples on the East Coast where birds have moved through an area, and we've been able to detect how those birds are interacting with these systems, right? So having that sort of monitoring happening as part of the deployment, I think, is going to be key, and it's going to be critical. And that maybe there are some mitigation measures. If we know that there's a bird migration happening because it's the right season or it's the right place, or we detect them coming through, then maybe we could shut down the turbines, just as one example of that. And so, I guess I'm saying both things, right? It's going to be really hard for us to detect those impacts, and certainly to have enough information a priori to say, we're going to be able to detect the impacts when we put them in, but we still need to be doing this work to understand what's happening in the ecosystems. And, I will say that we know that the oceans are changing, right? And so we know we don't have enough data as it is to understand exactly how they're changing. And so this is going to provide us with an unprecedented opportunity to be putting instruments on things that are out there to be able to try to get at some of that information.
Yeah, and to Ben's point, I mean, some of the work that's been happening on the East Coast, we've seen literally tens of millions of dollars invested on the East Coast into monitoring and understanding wildlife resources in the marine environment. More than we've seen in, decades of time trying to learn about the offshore space. So, it's been said that we know more about the surface of the moon than the ocean. And I don't think that's too far off, right, Ben? So, this idea that offshore wind is bringing the resources to bear, not only the financial resources, but the physical structures to enable the monitoring, this is a huge step forward for ocean science.
Yeah, and I'd like to weigh in here too, because Audubon prioritizes the monitoring and the development of these technologies. We participate in many of these technical advisory committees. And DOE has been really, really helpful in moving monitoring forward for birds and above the water for sure, and below the water as well. But I also want to say that just because there's a pause in that, this is a good time for us to understand research and to spend more time with research. And the states are still spending a lot of money on research. California Energy Commission and PUC has a great program called EPIC. Massachusetts has a great program. They're giving grants on understanding monitoring. New Jersey, New York. So the states are picking up a lot of the slack and funding this monitoring as it goes forward. We're very excited about the first kinds of what we're learning from the monitoring. On land, for instance, when you monitor wind turbines, you pick up dead birds. And here, with these instruments, you can actually see how the birds interact. In fact, if I can see the slide, I have one slide to show you. This is some of what we've learned in monitoring in the UK, and we'll learn more here in the US. We've learned a little bit. In Virginia, they have monitored with no collisions on demonstration turbine at CVAL. But here's the kinds of understanding we can have about different species of birds and how they react. For micro avoidance, actually in the turbine blade, or meso avoidance where they can go through the project, and a macro avoidance where they actually will go around and avoid, and we can get that down to species. So this is the great new kind of data that we can learn and protect birds at offshore wind. So we think it's a great step forward for environmentally responsible offshore wind.
Yeah, and I want to actually come back a little bit to what Ben was saying about being unable to really tease apart what is causing change in our environment. And I think this is kind of monitoring technology, but I think what's really important to bring back into perspective is the use of models. So if we can effectively validate our models with our monitoring technologies, then we can use those models to really look at change. And I think those are going to be critical moving forward.
Well, this feels like a good time to sort of shift into what we do with the information we gather from monitoring. And of course, sometimes we learn of impacts that can be avoided or minimized, and sometimes we do not. And so I want to cue mitigation, and I'm going to turn to Kris to kick us off here. Can you please, again, sort of a lay of the land for those who don't follow this closely, introduce us to the role of mitigation in addressing those impacts and moving toward coexistence? And in particular, given your experience on the topic, can you share a bit about what's been done on the East Coast regarding fisheries mitigation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, setting it up so well, we are called first to avoid, then to minimize, and then to mitigate potential impacts. And even within that bucket of mitigation, compensation, tends to be the one that, you're kind of the last resort. However, it is something that with the fishing community really has, frankly, I've been meeting with fishing stakeholders for longer than I'd probably care to recount. And oftentimes, in the first meetings, they'll say, well, who's going to write me a check? I'm not going to be able to fish there. Who's paying me back? And, it's not a bad question. Frankly, it's probably something we could have tackled a long time ago, and I applaud the West Coast efforts of the 7C Working Group for getting, to these issues much earlier on in your development cycle. But with the fishing community, even the projects that we've seen so far developing on the East Coast, for example, the Vineyard Wind project, if a fisherman can even, I like to think of it like your tax returns. You can either put in the standard deduction for your charitable gifts, or you can itemize your deductions. So the way it works for the Vineyard Wind project with the fishing community, if they can demonstrate that they had fished anywhere within that wind farm in a certain period of time, they can just apply for that standard refund and receive financial compensation for losses that they needn't necessarily demonstrate, but just rather demonstrate they were fishing. In other project models, looking at the Sunrise project, for example, or the South Fork project, fishermen need to demonstrate that there was actual inability to catch fish with the same level of effort working within that wind farm. So just to give you a sense, there are all these different type of projects that are set up to compensate fishermen on the East Coast for when they're not able to, meet their financial meet the financial expectations they have if they have fished the same amount because of offshore wind. Now, of course, we come back to the same questions of how you disambiguate impacts like climate and other things we know that are changing how fishermen are fishing and where the fish are. However, the offshore wind developers, I think, recognize that the compensation would be required, and so with the support of the state partners, SIOW, essentially initiated the development of a regional fisheries compensation fund for the entire Atlantic seaboard. This way, when the fishing community had an impact from fishing that could be essentially, demonstrated that was caused by wind farms, again, TBD on how that's all going to work. But if they can, file a claim through a claims administrator, they would then receive compensation, financial compensation. This is certainly, I think, it's a new space for certainly me and many folks working in offshore wind. I started like listening to those talcum powder commercials. Like, have you heard those? It's like, did you use talcum powder between the years of 2012 and 2000? You know, you can be compensated. So I started calling all of those people. I started calling all those claims administrators and saying, hey, would you do offshore wind? You know. So yes, we finally found someone brave enough to take on the project, and last November hired a claims administrator to figure out exactly how to design and develop a compensatory mitigation system on the East Coast for fishing. So again, this is different from fish. This is for fishermen. So we've been talking about monitoring the environment up here, but now we're talking actually about stakeholders. So I just want to make that also distinction. So we're in the process now of putting together this compensation program as you are here on the West Coast. And it's complicated. There's questions about who is eligible, what is compensable. There are a million questions to answer, but we do have a very, I think, really great comprehensive team put together on the East Coast, and would expect this program to open in the next year or so. So that's where we are with fishing compensatory mitigation.
Thank you. We did prep, and I am still learning very much on this panel. Garry, I want to turn to you for a sort of wildlife perspective, assuming that we cannot write checks to birds. What are the mitigation opportunities as they pertain to birds?
Well, actually, I think that's going to be pretty easy for compensatory mitigation anyway, because we have a long history of conserving seabirds with projects at work, like removing invasive species from islands, or protecting breeding grounds, or protecting wintering grounds. So I don't think that's going to be as difficult as it might be for other groups of species or other kinds of animals. But I will say that these birds, the difficult part may be because many of these birds come here seasonally, and they come from other countries. So the mitigation may have to occur in New Zealand or Chile or some other place. So there is going to be some interesting ways that we're going to be able to compensate for these birds if we have to do that. But I think it's fairly well known. We know the success. We know how to do it. So especially here in California.
Thank you. Clearly, this kind of reaching any kind of agreement around coexistence is going to require a lot of collaboration. Collaboration is somewhere, sort of an area that can always be improved upon. And so I'm going to turn to you, Grace. In what ways can collaboration between environmental scientists, offshore wind developers, and regulatory agencies and other interested stakeholders be improved to enhance wildlife monitoring and mitigation efforts?
Yeah, thanks. I think we're actually doing a pretty good job of getting a kickstart on this process. You know, we're following the leads of what the East Coast have done. They have the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, which I think previous panels have mentioned. And then there's the California Marine Sanctuaries Foundation effort now that is being supported by the Ocean Protection Council. So they're pulling together, what was it, 280 some scientists? Ben knows the answer.
It's over 200. I can't remember what the exact number is. There were. Let me just say, there were more federal participants in this process. We have very few feds that are currently participating.
Yeah. Well, they had an initial voice at least, but they're doing a really good job of pulling that together and gaining understanding of what needs to be done for California. I think perhaps it might be a good idea to start pulling in some local knowledge, some traditional knowledge into those groups. And importantly, I think, Ben, you touched on this very first question, is for, you know, that consideration of when we're putting these groups together and considering potential impacts, is keep that big picture in mind, right? What's the alternative? What if we continue doing nothing? What if we don't develop offshore wind? We already are seeing those impacts, right? So I think when these groups come together and we make our recommendations, just to recognize there are trade-offs. Whatever we do to this earth, there's going to be impacts. What are those trade-offs, and what are those trade-offs relative to doing nothing?
I think, just to add in, that during this period of a bit of a pause on the federal level, that this might be an actually great silver lining opportunity to actually let the research be released. Let's share the research. I think it's a great time to share the science for all the scientists who are working in the oceans and thinking about renewable energy, to start sharing with each other, to take take the time to really do that and to figure out what the next wave of research needs to be.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I do think that some of our first steps need to be taking the information that we have in hand and really trying to use that to understand, how variable are these systems? What do we know? And importantly, what are the gaps in our knowledge? What are the gaps in our understanding? How can we then sort of target some of that new monitoring and maybe some of these new technologies and other things to most efficiently fill some of those gaps? And then I'll just make my plea again as an academic scientist for data transparency. That I
Yes.
strongly urge regulators who can put teeth in agreements to insist that any data collected as any part of this is made public. Having data that someone goes out and collects data on a public resource and says this is proprietary information, I'm sorry, that doesn't fly. Can I say that, Garry? And again, like there are ways we know how to deal with fishing data that we can publish fishing data in a way that anonymizes it so that we aren't revealing individuals' fishing grounds. If there are some of those issues, we can find solutions to make certain aspects of this available and ensure the secrecy is the wrong word. What's the word I'm looking for? Ensure the confidentiality of those data that have legitimate reasons to not be made public, but just saying this data set is proprietary just doesn't make sense to me. And so,
I want to say we did that in the Atlantic with the Regional Wildlife Scientific Collaborative, and that it was set up specifically to make sure that data gets gathered and everybody knows where it is and that it's made public, especially for researchers to continue, so that they know where it is. It's not necessarily in one place, but it's all, you can access it through the collaborative. And so we need to do that here in California as well.
And the regulatory agencies have the opportunity to put those stipulations in any agreements that either power purchase agreements or permitting. Again, that's outside of my lane, but please do that.
Well, and I think we've heard a lot of feedback from the developers who say, please give us guidance. Please let us know exactly what the format should be and, what the specs are, because, the technical people want to be able to share the data, but there's a lot of challenges in kind of how to operationalize that. And they want the same standard for all the developers. So a project I've been working on with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and a couple universities in New Jersey, we've really been talking to a lot of stakeholders, whether that's through the development community or NGOs or others. And it's a really exciting project because it's actually putting together a set of standards and guidelines for what monitoring technology should look like in its physical manifestation in a wind farm. So, where do what kind of sensors are folks putting on the turbine, and, at what height, and what are they looking for, and how are they calibrated, and how often are they collecting, at what granularity? There's a million different questions once you start pulling back the layers of the onion. So it's refreshing and really, I think, an exciting project that we'll be releasing a report on later this year to provide some standards and guidance, since we, again, as Garry was mentioning, with the absence of federal direction right now, always the states picking up the mantle, and California's the best at that. You're like your own country here, so.
Well, and on top of that, or I guess sort of layered throughout it, right? Because these are reflections on really how to engage or enhance collaboration across particularly parties who get to work on this as their full-time job. But we also need to ensure that we're engaging stakeholders who have jobs outside of offshore wind but are impacted or affected by its development. And so, Kris, I'm going to come to you with this one. Can you reflect a bit on how stakeholders can best be represented in achieving coexistence and perhaps provide examples of where you've seen this work well?
Yeah, I mean, particularly with the fishing community. I think, they've been a vocal opponent on the East Coast from, the first days. And it's, seemed to have been incumbent upon the offshore wind developers to, make sure they're taking the lead when it's their project. And, the way that NEPA works, you really don't want to get your first complaints or feedback on a project once you submit your your COP and start that EIS process as part of NEPA. So, being out there early and figuring out a project configuration that works best for your stakeholders is really going to make the project flow in a way that, probably the developer wants to see. And one example I would give of this on the East Coast is there's actually a cluster of lease areas that's off the coast of Massachusetts where each of the lease areas is essentially, contiguous, and they all share a border. And so the fishing community started to be concerned because it's like a large fishing area, multiple lease areas are, potentially offshore wind farms being built. And how are they going to transit through these wind farms? How are they going to fish in the wind farms? And this was essentially, international precedent where the stakeholders work with the fishing community, and the Coast Guard was involved, and BOEM was involved, to develop a standard spacing for rows and columns within a wind farm, which was nominally 1 nautical mile by 1 nautical mile. Now, that is not the best way to build a wind farm if you want to collect wind in a grid. That's not the best way. You've heard about wake effects, right? So that's certainly not what the offshore wind developers want to do. And, frankly, untold dollars lost in energy production because of that compromise. But what it ended up doing was, to some degree, helping to bring the fishing community along and acknowledging that they had needs where the wind farm layout could be more conducive to kind of their existing uses. So that's really one, story of coexistence that I really, think really sends a lot home. But I have other stories, but we only have 19 minutes.
Well, I do want to tease out a little bit of a thread that came up in a few of your comments, and that was just around the role of industry here. If we can just maybe spend a couple of minutes, I don't know if you all were in the room for the permitting session before ours, but if you were, you heard a critique, and arguably a fair one, of the layers of mitigation requirements that can be thrust upon the industry. That may or may not collectively increase the protection of a species, but definitely make it harder to develop a project, and that there is likely room for more collaboration and discussion there to reach a solution that is sufficiently protective and allows the industry to develop at a pace and scale that the climate crisis demands. And so I just love your thoughts, and maybe this is for you, Kris, but invite the panel to weigh in as well, as for the role of industry in designing these mitigation and monitoring approaches. Ben.
So I guess in some ways, having like we've talked about, I think it's going to be really hard to be able to assign, this thing happened here, and therefore you must do this thing to make up for that. Garry mentioned lots of ways that we can do mitigation of birds that's really, really effective. I think one of the other huge opportunities that we kind of alluded to earlier is, the 2 wind farms that are proposed in California off Morro Bay and Humboldt. If they get built, they're going to provide us with an opportunity to have these things bristling with all of these new instruments, to collect data that we could never have collected before, to help us really understand what's happening in these systems, and possibly able to say, here are what some of these impacts are. If California is going to get to 100% renewable by 2045, we're probably going to need more than just these 2 wind farms on this coast, right? And so then this gives us an opportunity to collect tons of data to understand what some of the impacts might be, so that when we go to the next sets of wind farms, if that happens in the future, we understand much better about what's happening and what we can do to try to reduce some of those impacts, especially given, again, now that with the Trump administration announcing that it's going to try to cut funding to the Integrated Ocean Observing System, that is going to essentially make us blind to what's happening out in the oceans. Clearly, these wind farms are not going to compensate for that if that doesn't happen. But this is something just to think about as a way for us to view this, again, as Garry said, as an opportunity to think about how we move forward into the future.
Right, and Garry, did you want to go?
You want to go, Kris?
I'll go. Jersey girl talking too much. No, I mean, like in terms of the industry collaborations, I think well, on the East Coast, we have, the wind farms are all kind of closer together, right? You have all this space out here, but we have these wind farms where it's highly duplicative to have, maybe sensors on each turbine, for example, or on turbines where two wind farms are adjacent to each other. So working through industry collaborations, whether it's with the RWSC or through ACP working groups or things, to understand what is the most effective way, and things that are already layered into the permitting requirements, and then working from there instead of making it kind of such a burden, I think. And the biggest burden often is the risk or uncertainty of not knowing what they should do or collect, and then how that information could potentially be used. I think there's, the industry is not, unfamiliar with lawsuits. And so what data you collect then ends up being used against them to say, well, look, there are all these whales here. You shouldn't be building this. So it's, there's a sensitivity for sure.
And I will say that at Audubon, on land, we're working on 57 projects, solar and wind and transmission now. And we work early in these projects with the developers. And so I think the idea that Grace was talking about getting involved early with your stakeholders, maybe in a group or something, that's a great, great idea, just to listen, to figure it out. And I think the industry would be really smart, and I say this all the time, so this is not the first time, to get ahead of it and cooperate with the same protocols, the same kind of data collection, working with the agencies and working with the stakeholders to cooperate together and maybe figure out what's the best monitoring system that's available now when we're building our project, and we could buy it at scale and it wouldn't be expensive, and we could decide on what turbines, especially for projects that are next to each other, would be the best to monitor. They only monitor 30% of the turbines on land. They don't have to monitor every turbine. So, that kind of collaboration and standardization would really be helpful. Now I'm really seeing projects, everybody wants to do their own thing. And I think that's counterproductive, because for science, I'm not a scientist, it's probably obvious, but for scientists, they want that data to be standardized in some way so that they can interpret it. So I would suggest that the industry could get out ahead of everything and bring things to the agencies, and say, this is what we think. We've put this together. This is a great idea. We've done this in planning here in California at the DRECP. We've done it at the Central Valley for solar. You could do it for offshore wind. You could do that planning in advance and bring it to the agencies and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think building on that and what others have said here too is to take this time not just to plan, but to get out and do baseline assessments, right? There are existing monitoring technologies. They may not be as advanced as they will be in 5 years, but why not put things out there? Why not figure out what is close to baseline at this point? I'm gonna let Ben challenge what baseline is, but at least get some sort of understanding of what it'll take to understand baseline.
Yeah. And the initial the initial monitoring that we've seen in Virginia and also at Block Island shows that for birds, there were no collisions in Virginia in 2 years, I think. But we really did see how the birds interacted with the turbines. So I don't think we should be afraid of it. I think it's going to be good for a story. It's good for our members. They want to know that everything's good and safe. And so we want to tell that story.
Yeah, and I think, we saw some great, monitoring information released on the South Fork Wind Farm just a couple weeks ago with regard to the impacts and interactions with the benthic environment on the East Coast. And it'll be different with floating, but, this idea that we're building reef systems and we're being able to attract biomass to areas that was never available before. And, we have had, these suppositions, and we've seen this in Europe, but we haven't been able to directly monitor it in the US yet. So the first kind of long-term 2-year monitoring study of the South Fork Wind Farm, benthic surveys just came out a couple weeks ago, and really cool videos. Treat yourself to just watching some of the videos of the fish swim around the turbines. It's really cool.
Well, and that is an excellent segue to where I want to take us next, which is to the role of and the importance of sharing and translating the lessons that we're learning from this monitoring technology and the offshore wind endeavors to date. Particularly in this moment, right? We want to do what we can to counter the rampant misinformation and opposition that offshore wind is facing, and so I'd love to take us into a line of discussion just around the role that science and the data being gathered can play, especially noting that a lot of misinformation centers on wildlife and the sort of falsified or exaggerated claims around impacts to wildlife. So I'm going to start with you, Grace. Can you just share a bit on how can collected data that's collected from wildlife monitoring around offshore wind projects be integrated into the broader conservation efforts and policy making to ensure sustainable development?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to lead with a little quip by, I think it's called Brandolini's Law, is the amount of energy required to refute BS is an order of magnitude greater than that required to produce it. So data and what we're doing here, communicating data, I think is going to be of utmost importance. We've already touched on a lot of the issues with data, the requirements for standardization, protocols behind not just how we collect it, but how we store data and how it's calibrated and all that. And usability is also critically important, right? We can collect the most perfect, trustworthy data that are all in the exact same format, but if nobody can get to it, it's going to be completely useless. So we need to serve them up in accessible formats. I think the East Coast, Garry, you had mentioned a couple sites earlier, Marco and what was the other one you had said?
NROC, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, those two really wonderful sites for downloading data. But I think for them to be important for policy making and decision making, we need to collate data that are useful for the end user, right? So, for example, I think someone in the previous panel had mentioned the PackWave site. We're involved in a project where we're helping take PackWave site data and pull them together to meet the monitoring and mitigation measures. So it's called the Environmental Data Integration and Assessment Tool. We're piggybacking off of what others are doing. So Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is doing a wonderful job at standardizing those data, pulling them into a big data lake. And what we're doing isn't just putting it into context for a regulator. So we've got the underwater noise data that are collected by PackWave. We put the thresholds on there, but not for regulators to come in and say, hey, there's an exceedance, do something. It's really in the context of all the metocean data. Oh no, there's a storm. We can explain that exceedance with the storm data. Or hey, we have shipboard AIS. You can see at 8 o'clock in the morning, all the fishermen go out and the noise goes up. So providing that context and putting all the data together for the end user and the end use, I think is going to be very important.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, I mean, you may have heard this expression about people making decisions not on facts, but on feelings. And I think this current, really bipartisan climate, a lot of that is driven, obviously, certainly by feelings, not facts. And, you all are smart fact people. But as Grace was saying, essentially, for me, the way I think about it is how you tell the story with the facts, what you use them to do. And we do have great story mappers on the East Coast through the Marco and NROC data portals. And when you enter, certain queries, they present you pictures of people and they talk about what this means to everyday life. And if I don't think we lead with the stories and the why any of this matters anyway, then, changing any hearts and minds is, I don't think it's even on the table.
Thank you.
And we put out a report that we hope will be widely circulated and widely quoted and widely read by our members and other members, and it's written by our scientists, it's written by our policy experts, it's written by our advocates. So, that's how we're putting out a message to combat that kind of opposition.
And to be clear, the QR code does not go to Garry's report. It is an invitation to ask questions.
It should go to Garry's report.
But I do want to turn to you, Ben, because I do, to be fair to the scientists on the panel and in the room, I recognize that translate your data to counter misinformation is not a fair task or request. And so I'd love for you to remark a bit on maybe setting some fair expectations, level setting, both for the public and for policymakers. What can we expect data to do for us in this challenging time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the misinformation question is obviously enormous. Thank you, Donald Trump, for making that such a salient part of our daily existence of nonsense and lies. Sort of to Grace's point, I actually disagree with you. I think it is far greater than an order of magnitude of effort that is required to. Yeah, it's really easy to come up with a bunch of nonsense and tweet some stuff out, and then if you're trying to refute that, I mean, it is literally playing whack-a-mole, because you can spend months trying to address this nonsense that someone came up with, and then as soon as you address it, they're going to come up with 5 more bits of nonsense, and we basically will spend our entire time chasing nonsense, which it's a bad use of all of our time. But I will say that as the scientific community in general has been really bad about communicating why what we do is important. We have pointy heads. We sit in the corner. We talk in lingo. We talk in numbers. And we're not good at the storytelling that Kris alluded to. And I think that's the key. Is not just. I think it goes beyond making the data available so that any user can go on and generate the things that they're interested in. I actually think it's figuring out what those stories are. Those great stories, like that slide, right? That's a great story, and that should be newsworthy. And so we need. I guess we need better PR people, which I am not,
marketing.
right? I mean, and we've known this for a long time, that science communication is key, and that we are, at least the scientists, are bad at this. But there are lots of people who are really good at communication and really good at PR to tell those sorts of stories and make that a headline. The headline can be, birds avoid offshore wind turbines and don't die. That's a headline. People are going to click on it, right? If you want clickbait, there's your story, right? And so I think that's part of the key, is figuring out what those little nuggets are, relating them to people and why people care about them, and just telling these stories over and over again. The crazies about misinformation, are really good at saying the same thing over and over again that's not true, and then all of a sudden people believe it, right? Not to get political, I'm going to. January 6th, right? A mob stormed the Capitol, right? It was a riot that our current president pointed at the Capitol, and now somehow 4 years later, because they've been saying, oh no, it wasn't a riot, it was a bunch of patriots just having a stroll through the Capitol. They've said this over and over again for how many years, and now people believe that.
Ladies and gentlemen, happy hour will be here soon.
Okay, but so like the scientists, we need to take that strategy, right? Instead of making stuff up and saying things that aren't true over and over again, we can just say things that we know and say them over and over and over again.
I think you have a second career in PR.
I definitely do not.
Yeah, I disagree on your self-deprecating comment about your communication, and I hope we are living up to our challenge, our promise of keeping the audience awake. We do have an excellent audience question on the screen, and our time is winding down, so I want to take a moment to invite the panel to comment on this question. Offshore wind presents the opportunity to gather data about its own potential impacts, but it also presents opportunities to gather data that we would not be able to gather without offshore infrastructure. What other opportunities are there?
I want to answer this one because we've talked about this at Audubon all the time. We know more about seabirds than we ever did because of all the science that's going on out there in the ocean. And that's great because we don't know enough about seabirds.
And jumping into the marine mammals, there have been concerned about the right whale for, centuries, right? No research done on it for a really, really long time. We have similar issues with the Rice's whale, which is largely being ignored now because there's no offshore wind development there.
We've kind of alluded to this, right? That we have an opportunity to put stuff out in places that we've never been able to access with any ease. It's going to tell us so much about these oceans and how not only organisms interact with the turbines themselves, but what they're doing out in these places that we don't know because it's so hard and so expensive to get out there.
Yeah, I want to thank the wind industry for actually developing this data. So thank you guys.
Well, and on that note, our next audience question is about the cost of what we've been discussing here today, that collecting this data is expensive. Who is going to pay? This is not necessarily an energy customer responsibility and shouldn't be a part of the power purchase agreement. So who do you all suggest foots the bill for this research?
Go ahead, scientist.
I think there should be public-private partnerships. I mean, it would be lovely if the federal government continued to fund the ongoing monitoring programs that it is currently funding. That would be a nice first step. But I do think that having the developers pay for some of this as well, that they're going to make a lot of money, and the relative cost of collecting these data, while yes, they're expensive, compared to what I think of as a budget, it's pretty cheap relative to the cost of all of the things that are going to be involved in this. And so, we've talked about this in other situations, that having some sort of a fund that developers pay into, that is some way an escrow fund, and that the funding is then allocated to the organizations to go do the research that avoids both real and perceived conflicts of interest and gives us that transparency that we need.
I think it's a shared responsibility. We all want that data. We all want responsible offshore wind.
And really quickly, I think a lot of sensors can be used for not just wildlife monitoring, but infrastructure monitoring at the same time. So there's some savings there.
Thank you all. Well, to end us on a, if not hopeful, at least a productive note, which may be the best we can ask for these days, I just want to do a real quick rapid fire down the panel, because I'm sure this is something you all have been thinking about in your day-to-day, but we have this unfortunate gift of time from the federal administration, and so we've heard a lot of talk about weathering the storm and staying the course, but also about making the most of this sort of breather in the pressure that we felt under the Biden administration. And so if you look out onto these next 4 years, when there will be a more hopeful day on the horizon for offshore wind development and picking that pace back up, what is something that you hope we have ready to go for that moment? What do you have sort of as your charge to use this time well? I see Garry's up with the mic, and then we'll
People
hop back
get
to-
ready. Transmission, absolutely, ports, and research. We have a lot of research coming out in the next few months. Let's absorb it and let's share it publicly, and let's share it with each other so we understand it.
Kris?
Yeah, I'd love to see, and I want to give total props to BOEM for moving their siting process so much over the past 20 years, I would say, to something that's more collaborative with the existing ocean users. But I would love to see, a truly collaborative siting process for wind energy areas and offshore leasing areas, so that we can speed things up on the back end and avoid a lot of the conflicts that come later.
I would love to see that data synthesis work happening. That will give us much greater insight into what's happening in these spaces than we currently have, and really set us up to go figure out what it is that we need to monitor going forward.
I'm just going to agree with everyone else because we're over time.
Thank you all. Please join me in thanking this panel.
Thanks, Amber.
Thanks, Amber.